Let's talk a little bit about super cycles, what that might mean for Bitcoin, and also how this may play into the broader market. And I think the ongoing debate is Bitcoin a store of value, a speculative asset? We'll break it all down for you today. My name is Paul Barrow. We'll come back into Tech Path. Let's go into a couple of points. Before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor, and that is Tangem. If you're looking at self-custody, this is one thing that I think a lot of people are starting to explore now, and that is moving your tokens maybe off of exchanges, and you want to hold them through a bull market, maybe a long-term storage. This is one of the ways you can do it. All you have to do is visit tangem.com, click on that little blue section up there in the top right, and that's going to take you into the selection of the cards. And you can buy a 3-card set, a 2-card set, get the 3-card. What this will do is it works in tandem with the app, and the app is super slick, and I think you guys will like it. And it's also very easy to operate. So pretty much anybody out there, even if you're not tech savvy, you'll like it. Let's get into a few topics today. Core inflation comes in, and a few things happened today. One was, of course, Kobe kind of hitting on this, and this is rising inflation going up to 3.2, above the expectations of 3.1. Many people would look at that and say, okay, that's not a huge bump. I mean, even though still a 1-point move when you're expecting a 3.1 flat move is a big deal. And I think the core inflation is probably one of the bigger things to watch from a trend standpoint. Core CPI fell to 3.8, above expectations of 3.7. This is the 35th consecutive month with inflation above 3%. Very sticky. And of course, everybody is kind of been talking about this already, is that we're going to continue to see this pushback of a potential Fed pivot. Now, remember, this is also bad for the current election cycle. If we continue to see these kinds of pushes on inflation, this is not good for the current administration. The only situation that kind of comes out of this is where you start to see stimulus start to play in. So this is something that I think a lot of people are starting to play into. And if you think about just where we could see a cut, many people were saying, okay, including myself, thinking May might be the window. I'm looking at June, possibly even the July period before we truly see, and that is if we see a cut, providing we see more data coming in here in the spring. I want to go to a clip real quick. This is going into whether or not crypto could be a super cycle. Listen in.
That the central banks are debasing currency. They're making our money less valuable. So we're looking for things that are a store of value over time. That's not necessarily against goods inflation. It's against the thing that governments and central banks always do. They clip the corners off the coins until you've got no coin left. That's a way of taxing you without you knowing. And that's to pay the debts that the government has because of the aging population and all the debts out there. That creates a super mega trend within this. Now, it as a space is growing on average, including the bear markets, which are brutal as we all know, it's growing at 100% a year as a space. So there are 516 million wallets as of end of last year, active wallets. If it's growing at 100%, by the end of this year, it's 1 billion. Then the end of the year after, it's 2 billion. So the numbers are vast as people are adopting it. Now, the difference here between this and the internet or the mobile phone is we were users of the internet and mobile phone, but we didn't make money out of it unless you happen to own the right shares. But nobody could own the infrastructure of the internet. Different parts were. Here, you can actually own the thing by owning a token.
I always love to hear Raul. He's got I think, a pragmatic approach toward trying to look at this, because it is one of the largest debates out there is how does Bitcoin hold up in a recession? How does Bitcoin hold up when we do see, and if we do see the potential of de-dollarization? There's a lot of factors looking at this as what other speculative assets would you go into? So I think this is still a big question mark as to how a super cycle might come about. One of the things that will be a killer of a super cycle, of course, is a recession. JP Morgan CEO right now estimating, this is Jamie Dimon, 65% chance of a recession. I don't know where they get these numbers on these recessions. There was a couple of points in this article that I thought were interesting. Diamond stated that he would not be willing to rule out stagflation, setting in and explained that U.S. markets are displaying some characteristics of a bubble, which he mostly linked to the COVID era stimulus packages. And further into this is something that Robert Kiyosaki has said often, is that we're in the biggest bubble in history. Now, I still think that even though you look at the Magnificent Seven and where the S&P is, primarily driven by AI narrative, and the question mark is, why have we not seen the U.S. hold or begin to pull back down to a more normalized inflation number? And I think this is something that we've talked about before, is maybe the normalized inflation number is higher. Now, I know the Fed is still very tactical in trying to get to that 2% number, but remember, they kind of changed the narrative on this when they went in before Congress, and they were talking about how they were adjusting inflation prior to COVID, when we saw 2% inflation and zero interest rates. And they said, well, we really don't want to use that anymore, even though they were upcycling inflation. So there were some things that they were doing, Feds, basically a little bit of loophole and gymnastics to get to that number that they're not willing to do now. So it still pushes this into a very interesting play in this bull market, because we're essentially defying pretty much all odds here right now with what Bitcoin is doing over 70K, what we're seeing with Ethereum, what we're seeing in digital assets as a whole. Is this finally the shift that does drive it into a super cycle? I want to go into one more clip here. This is talking about stimulus. Listen in.
We're now creating these global nation states that are digital, that operate outside of the US or the UK or Europe. And they need a system of, as we get more digital, each day our lives get more digital. Digital assets now have value. This digital infrastructure is much more efficient at moving stuff around and recording the ownership. So if we now go to this system where in the United States you buy a house and it gets stamped and go to a notary and then it get recorded in a registrar, this can be instantaneous, everywhere and nowhere, and always verifiable. So it's really the operating system for the digital age. And without it, it kind of doesn't function. It's all a bit clunky. But with this, it's instantaneous settlement, recorded ownership, and transfer of everything.
Now, one thing to think about when Raul is talking about that, the idea of where the blockchain is, what smart contracts do for technology, and really kind of this shift in the demographic, because I think that's the bigger one. You have to think about the demographics, whether it's boomers, even my generation, Gen X, thinking about the financial architecture and how it's been built. Now you have millennials, Gen Z, and eventually what we'll see in the next generation, in the alpha generation, that have completely looked at finance in a different way. And they're going to look at it in a different way, in the sense of more of a digital transaction measurement. And the fact that we see all of this moving into so many categories, gaming, possibly the tokenization of real world assets, how structure will look in the future for financial, instruments is going to be pretty significant. I think that's the thing that Raul is getting at. There are some things around, some things he talked about in terms of trueflation that kind of waffle a little bit compared to traditional inflation. This was just a quick tweet on, the CPI data by Trueflation. This is actually out there on the blockchain, but it's showing the UK and the US there quite a bit lower than what our registered inflation is right now. At least that's coming from the Fed. Even though I still think those numbers, in many cases, when you start chopping up inflation like we do, and the service sector is one that we're watching closely, continuing to stay flat, I still think that one is the one that will correct the ship. And we're starting to see signals of that right now with things like restaurant and hospitality trends starting to slow in the first quarter. And here we are, early March. We'll see how that plays out. This may be the one thing that does take us into some new numbers. Another thing to talk about is, this stimulus idea of what that might look like. Remember that the White House put out this post not too long ago, and he was President Biden, calling for Congress to provide an annual tax credit. This would basically give Americans like a $400 a month credit for the next couple of years for mortgages, mainly offset where the mortgage rates are. So the outlook is that at some point we would see mortgage rates come down. That's an interesting concept. And whether you believe that that is stimulus or not, the idea of injecting any kind of reduction or capital back into the system, this is going to come from somewhere. So it is going to cost printing. Obviously, faith in the system as a whole, the dollar, that's where de-dollarization comes into play. And that's when people start looking for alternative assets. So what do you put your money in? That's the big question I think that everybody's talking about right now. Other things out there, this of course is a quick note on the rising influence around politicians and the elections themselves. And I think that's the thing that could start to play very heavily into 2024 and also be in timing. You know, we've talked about this on the channel quite a bit. Timing of crypto, blockchain, and Bitcoin with the same scenario that's playing around what's happening with a lot of the candidates right now. And I think, you know, Vivek probably was one that let it off fairly well, but also RFK, you know, has also been going at it pretty strong in terms of his positioning. And now you even had Trump, you know, here recently kind of getting a little bit more soft, even though I don't think he has taken a position yet. And I think that's one of the areas we need to get him to take a position on. But funding is also coming in from crypto voters who prioritize candidates' positions. This has been through most of the actions by Coinbase and a lot of the, you know, the political action committee or centers that are starting to draw in a lot more not investment, but support of those candidates. With that being the case, you look at a couple other things. Nearly 20% of the respondents reported holding cryptocurrencies, more people holding Bitcoin and others. Adoption rates higher. This goes back into the demographic shift that we're talking about. Black, Hispanic, also into the demographic shift. Gen Z, demographic shift. And now I think finally you have all of these candidates realizing this and saying, okay, this is not going away, and it's definitely getting into the new voter. And I think that's where the future holds a lot of opportunity here. Other things that people have to consider right here is things like this: surpassing inflation figures, not necessarily going to halt crypto's bull market. This is an interesting take on this because many people would say, okay, well, if inflation is continuing to be very sticky, why wouldn't we see the potential of Bitcoin go down? It's the same thing we say all along, is that that's when these alternative investments start to be the hedge against inflation. So there's too much bullish momentum in crypto. You still have to think about where the ETFs are going. Inflows are very strong, continues to push toward this. And of course, you have BlackRock even allocating Bitcoin ETF to 2 of its asset management funds. That's only showing more confidence in digital assets as a whole, specifically Bitcoin. Other things that you have to kind of think about is this tweet right here, which I think, I don't know if it's relevant in the sense of, you know, what's happening, but the idea that GBTC is continuing to do some things to make the outflows a little bit less impactful on their own fund, I think it is an interesting approach. This is what Balchunas was talking about, where GBTC basically said, hey, they're creating a mini low-fee version of GBTC. This is an interesting thing because GBTC has been pretty much the killer app in Bitcoin when it comes to an ETF. And if they're doing this right now, what it does show is there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of pressure, and it's coming from you know who. And if that's the case, that means there's demand. And demand is the number one thing that continues to drive where the markets are, where we're seeing Bitcoin hit over 72K. Likelihood is how this plays out now into some of the other digital assets, which we've already started to see on the move here recently. By the way, make sure and fill out the poll there, guys. We'll get to that here in a second. And if you have a few questions, we'll try to get to some of those as well. Now, a few of those are coming in right now. Other things to watch. And this is another clip. I want to get into back on this Supercycle concept and whether or not this is the period in which we could see this. This is a clip I think that'll make a little bit more sense. Listen in.
There's a 60% chance that's just a normal crypto cycle. So Bitcoin finishes 150 to 250,000, i.e. it does a few X the last all-time highs. There's a 20% chance that because of the ETF and how the economic cycle works, everyone gets overexcited about rate cuts, whatever, that we kind of front load it and it's short. But then there's another 20% chance that this actually extends further than we expect because institutions and others come into the space and it broadens out. So I think 60% chance normal cycle, 20% super cycle, 20% actually a short cycle.
All right, so interesting. I think Raul kind of backed out a little bit there on the super cycle idea. When you look at all the, scenarios that have put themselves in this market, I think the ETFs would be the biggest, but the regulatory front and the political front, these are unknowns. And to me, this is the one that probably has the capacity of turning it into a super cycle. Because if you do get enough people concerned about inflation, the de-dollarization, the issues from what's happening in the BRICS nations, where gold is going, all of those kind of scenarios, then you have, almost like the old Peter Schiff argument, which is, Bitcoin is not good for anything except a speculative asset, all of those kind of things. And I think that that's the bigger question here is, as we see so many people trying to understand how this market moves forward, where do they put their money? And that's, I don't know, 60% to the traditional. I'd love to hear you guys. Do you think that's more of a traditional cycle that we're in now? I just don't see that as much. A little bit heavier on super cycle. I want to get into another kind of the last clip he had here, which was predictions. And he doesn't give predictions very often. Raul Powell talked about this, and he gave predictions on Bitcoin, ETH, and Sol. Listen in.
I'm kind of thinking Bitcoin finishes this cycle closer to 250,000. I think a lot of people are lower. I think it might be higher because of the dynamics of the ETF and other stuff. I'm pegging Ethereum between 15 and 20,000. And I'm pegging Solana between 750 and 1,000. So my view is Bitcoin starts the cycle and outperforms in the start. Then people go out the risk curve. ETH, we're going to have an ETH ETF. We'll see the market pick up there.
Right.
But the horse that's moving faster is the one that's coming from a smaller adoption base. It moves faster.
Faster smart contract network. And obviously my good friend Anatoly, I'm rooting for him, and I own a lot of that. So,
all right, so that's a rare price adjustment there by Raul. I'm interested on those numbers. I'm not maybe quite as strong on any of those in this cycle. Looking at this right now, the one hinging factor will be if inflation holds longer and we don't see a rate cut. If we don't see a rate cut till later in the year, meaning let's say Q4, that's where things could get very, very interesting in this cycle, because timing is going to be very critical. Elections, where inflation is at the time. Remember, if inflation is still pegging high, that's a huge, whumping stick for Trump and the Republicans on the Dems of this has got out of hand and that we need to recorrect it. So there's so many plays that could go into this. Now, the other thing that gets into this is the issue with ETH and whether or not we're going to see an ETH ETF. Still questionable, actually starting to slide in terms of probability. We talked about that yesterday in yesterday's show. This is going to get, I think it's getting less likely, but at the same time, I'm still optimistic about an ETH ETF. If an ETH ETF comes in, then you have to consider the adoption curve for an ETF for Ethereum. Would people truly go that direction? I still think that an ETF for ETH may not see the numbers that we're seeing, because remember, it's that demographic divide that is out there. Most people that are going to buy Ethereum, I think, will go get direct exposure. I just feel like that demographic does not need an ETF, but we'll see how all this plays. Speaking of ETH, countdown to Dinkan right here, 19 hours away. To my knowledge, this is going to land. Remember, this is the upgrade that really changes layer 2 fees for a lot of transactions out there, especially I think in microtransactions, which again will be very positive for Ethereum, just as a sidestep. Other thing to look at right here, of course, is Bloomberg. This was interesting to me. I want to play this clip for you guys. Let me play this real quick. Here we go.
I mean, dog with hat for whatever reason, just catching the meme zeitgeist. But you also offer, there's other products out there that you have, and you have exposure to the likes of Tezos. I'm looking at what you've got, Avalanche, Uniswap. How are you seeing real desire to be going outside Bitcoin and ETH?
So we've seen obviously a lot of concentrated desire in Bitcoin at the moment because of the arrival of the US ETFs. We'll see if that dynamic also spreads to ETH as this regulatory process in the US moves forward. I think beyond sort of those top two names, we've actually seen quite an uptick in demand, including from institutional investors in that longer tail. And we're quite a unique firm in that capacity. We're really the only people who offer that broad of a suite. It's about 40 products outside of the US, covering all sorts of different assets. And what we've seen is an interest in that longer tail being driven by some of our largest clients who are now looking at blockchain applications and adoption of blockchain applications in a very different light. I think, a key name there would be something like Solana, where we've seen an enormous amount of interest over the last several months. And that's continued as I think the overhang from some of the black swan events has dissipated and the bankruptcy estates have come undone, and you're starting to look at those on-chain metrics that I just mentioned, and you're seeing that actually there's some interesting things happening within those communities and within these ecosystems that may or may not be.
So one thing that they hit on there is kind of this departure from the traditional cycles of investing. Now, this could be a time in history where we're seeing the first true shift in a financial mechanism. In the past, it's always been the US dollar. We've looked at gold as being a massive asset class. You look at the potential here of even the S&P starting to isolate in with no longer the Mag 7. Now we're talking more around the Mag 4 or 5. But the point is that is this the time in which the spread of information and understanding of what blockchain means and what it could mean, especially in real world assets, tokenization, the gaming sectors, retail sectors, NFTs starting to move into brand IP, all those kind of things are massive opportunities, and they're here right now, where AI is still maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, or longer out. So I think this is where what she's talking about is these speculative investors who are willing to take that next step. Definitely some interesting times for sure. Last tweet here, I thought this was interesting. Let me see if I can refresh this tweet right here and pull it up because we had one coming in. I don't know if you guys have had problems. Don't forget, by the way, get some questions over on the side. We'll try to get back to those. I'll go to this right here. 350K in 2 days, going to be hysterical. Yeah, here we go. All right. This was the whole idea behind WIF, and they were trying to put this on the Sphere in Vegas. But the point being is you had, CNBC, mainstream media starting to talk about what's happening with these meme coins. And I think that, to me, represents kind of a next generation, which is what I talk about quite a bit. Looking at the charts, just a quick bit, and then we'll get into, actually, let's go to the poll real quick before we go to the charts. Let's take a look. All right, here we go. What happens first? Bitcoin 75. Most everybody's in on 75, and Solana still holding the lead, but everybody is on Bitcoin. So this is definitely the tail wagging the dog. I like it. All right, let's take a look at that beast right now. Bitcoin holding right now around 71. It did dip down into 70,000 numbers, but I think we're going to continue to see a positive move. One thing that's interesting is sentiment is still holding fairly solid on Bitcoin, even though we are seeing kind of our low line sentiment start to drop slightly. The one that has been I shouldn't say surprising, because this is going to be a big week, and that is Avalanche. I mean, look at these 2 days right here. This is crazy. It's now cracking back above 56 as we're streaming live here on the 13th. So this will be one for sure to watch. I should say on the 12th. One to watch, because I think we did an Avalanche video yesterday. If you guys didn't check it out, or make sure and go look at it, because there's a lot happening within the Avalanche ecosystem. I think there's going to be a lot of adoption, or I should say announcements, that is going to spur adoption. And then we had a team on that, and really kind of analysis, I think, of where gaming is going. Avalanche is still one of the hot commodities out there. Let's go to a couple of questions real quick. Rafa says, Raul's prices look good to him. I mean, I don't like doing those as much, but I will say, if I was going to listen to somebody as a price prediction, I would probably kind of peg up against Raul, in the sense that I think he has enough of an understanding about the entire market, because he's really into smart contracts. He understands the rest of the crypto market. He's not so much of a Bitcoin maxi. Polkadot keeps creeping up. Paul, what are your thoughts on DOT? Listen, that was one we played in the last bull run fairly hard. I haven't watched Dot as much, and we haven't reported on it. We probably should do a video on Polkadot again to really see how it's coming along, because there was a lot of promises and there was a lot of projects that had spun out of the Polkadot, which I think, Solana has kind of stolen the show on, and also the devs. That's the other factor. You kind of follow where the developers are going, which is what we've been watching here closely. Thoughts on Link? I like Chainlink. And I think it's going to be a very critical component in a lot of major events that are going to be happening this year. So watch for Chainlink for sure. Pith doing great. Obviously Pith is the alternate to Chainlink. So if you like oracles and you want to play a hedge, go to Pith. That's on Solana. Easy to get to as well. So super chat, thanks a lot. Darth coming in. Anytime GBTC puts coins on Coinbase, leverage short it, buy more spot BTC and cheaper prices, rinse and repeat. That's kind of a cycle that has been played out here, and I would kind of agree with that there are those kind of strategies going on. Did you guys hear our clip on Sailor yesterday of how MicroStrategy was leveraging against this? I mean, that was a very interesting analysis as well. Go back and watch that video, because he had some interesting statements as to how MicroStrategies is playing this. So if you didn't like the ETF side, you could hedge over here with a master investment. How about Jupe? Okay, well, listen, Jupiter is going to continue, I think, explode just because of the Solana ecosystem. And it by far, when you look at the volume compared to Uniswap, Jupe is right there. It's right there. We got to probably pull up and see what the most latest volume is comparison. Kakinu incoming. That's another one we like. Our team really likes Kakinu for sure. I'm more on the dog with hat, so that's just me. Thoughts on Polygon? If I'm going to play a meme coin, which to me is complete. By the way, I do not tell anybody, which I give no financial advice, but don't go out to those unless you're willing to lose it all. It's just one of those things. Listen, it's a meme. Have fun with it. Any idea why AVAX is lagging? I don't know if it's lagging today. I mean, you've got two major up days. It went from, what was that? Let's just take a look at the growth here on Avalanche just in the last little bit. Here we are at 35% in 2 days. I mean, come on, guys, how much can you say is going to move? That if we continue to see, that's a major move in just a couple of days. Others that watch tokens like Solana, of course, has been continuing to slide up, holding that 150 range, which is pretty interesting to watch. Another one that we've been pretty consistent on has been Flow. We've talked about that. It's still continuing its trek up the charts right now to about $1.50. Cardano. Do I talk about Cardano? I don't talk about Cardano probably enough, but I will say I just don't invest in it. I'm looking at different kind of projects that maybe are a little bit more aggressive, not necessarily in what they're doing, but in terms of the ecosystem, games, what kind of projects, partnerships, development are they doing? Because that's really where the narrative flies. And if you look at investing in this kind of framework, you compare it to kind of like the dot-bomb era. You look at winners and losers, high risk, high reward, and where are the opportunities long term. That's where I think you have to play all this. All right, listen, if you guys like these early live streams, let us know. Smash the like button right now. Maybe we'll do some more earlier in the day for you. If you like our 3 o'clock, let me know as well. Just drop some comments down below. If you're not in our Diamond Circle, get in there. It's a great place to get additional content. And we also have a Telegram group that is now only Diamond Circle members. So make sure and check it out. And of course, you can catch me on X at Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.